in the heart of West Texas, where the sky itself can turn against you. A widow stands on the edge of losing everything. Not just her home, but 3 children who depend on her promise to never let them be torn apart. As a violent flood rises and the world closes in, a man the town calls a criminal rides straight into danger. But is he a threat? Or their only chance to survive? Stay with this story because nothing is as it seems, and sometimes the people we fear the most are the ones who save us.
The sky over the Pecos River didn't look right. It was 5:30 in the morning. The clouds hung low, thick. They were the color of bruised copper, like an old penny left out in the dirt. Out here in West Texas, that color meant only one thing. The sky was getting ready to break. Maggie Calloway stood on the porch of the rented cabin. Both hands were wrapped around a mug of stale coffee. It was cold, but she drank it anyway. It was the only quiet moment she was going to get all day, the only moment she didn't have to be strong. Inside the cabin, 3 children were sleeping. Clara's children. Clara had been gone exactly 6 weeks. Pancreatic cancer. It took her fast, leaving behind a jagged hole in the world and 3 kids who didn't understand why their mother wasn't coming back. Maggie had promised Clara she would take them. She'd promised she would keep them together. But promises don't pay the rent. Maggie leaned against the wooden railing. She closed her eyes. Her bank account had exactly $340 left in it. The custody hearing was in 11 days, and she was bone-tired, a deep, aching exhaustion that settled in her marrow. She was a 44-year-old widow. She had survived a war zone as a combat nurse. She had survived the sudden death of her husband Daniel 3 years ago. But this? Raising 3 grieving orphans on a school nurse's salary? It was breaking her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It jarred her. Nobody called at 5:30 in the morning with good news. She pulled it out. The screen was cracked, but she could read the caller ID. It was the lawyer from Child Protective Services. Maggie swiped the screen. "Hello?" "Margaret," the voice on the other end said. It was crisp, professional. "I'm sorry to call so early, but the board just reviewed your file for the final adoption hearing." Maggie gripped the phone tighter. "And?" "They found a problem. A big one. The county updated the FEMA flood maps last month. That cabin you're renting on the Pecos, it's zoned in a high-risk floodplain now. The state won't approve a permanent placement in a hazardous zone." Maggie stared out at the dark river. "I can't afford to move right now. You know that. I just need a few months." "You don't have a few months," the lawyer said softly. "You have until the hearing. If you don't secure suitable housing by then, the state is going to take custody of Rosa, Tommy, and Lily. They'll be placed in the foster system. Margaret, you need to leave that cabin." Static crackled on the line. "I'm not losing them," Maggie said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I promised Clara." "Then find a way out," the lawyer said. And the line went dead. Maggie lowered the phone. A heavy drop of water hit the cracked screen. Then another. She looked up. The copper sky had turned a violent, bruised purple. The wind picked up, whipping through the mesquite trees, and then the bottom fell out of the sky. It wasn't rain, it was a deluge, a solid wall of water slamming into the parched Texas dirt. Maggie rushed back inside, slamming the front door against the wind. The noise was deafening. It sounded like a freight train running right over the roof. She checked her phone again to look at the weather radar, but the signal was gone. Dead. From the small bedroom, a whimper cut through the sound of the storm. Maggie hurried in. Lily, the youngest at 4 years old, was tossing on the mattress. Maggie placed a hand on the little girl's forehead. She was burning up. A fever. Rosa, the 11-year-old, sat up in the bed next to her. Her dark eyes were wide, but her jaw was set. Rosa was trying hard to be tough. Too hard for an 11-year-old. "Is it a flood, Mama Maggie?" "It's just a storm, sweetie," Maggie said. But she knew it was a lie. In the corner, Tommy was awake, 7 years old. He hadn't spoken a single word since the day his mother was buried. He just sat cross-legged on his blanket, clutching a small sketchbook to his chest, staring at the window. Maggie walked to the window and wiped away the condensation. Her stomach dropped. The Pecos River had jumped its banks. What was usually a lazy, muddy stream was now a raging, churning beast of brown water, and it was moving fast. She looked toward the east, toward FM 2400. The dirt road was gone, completely washed out. A mudslide had swallowed it whole. They were trapped. Maggie didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford in Fallujah, and she couldn't afford it now. The tired widow disappeared. The combat nurse took over. "All right, listen to me," Maggie said, her voice clear and sharp. "Rosa, I need you to pack a bag. Clothes, blankets, and whatever dry food we have in the pantry. Tommy, grab my first aid kit from the bathroom. We are moving up to the attic." Rosa frowned, her voice trembling just a little. "Why the attic?" "Because water always seeks the lowest ground," Maggie said, picking up Lily. The little girl was limp, her skin too hot against Maggie's neck. "And we are going to seek the highest." For the next 4 hours, it was a blur of survival. Maggie found a can of red spray paint in the utility closet. She leaned out the front door, the wind lashing her face, and sprayed a thick red line on the porch pillar. A watermark. Every 15 minutes, she checked it. The water crept up. 1 inch, then 3, then half a foot. By mid-morning, the water was pooling on the floorboards of the living room, muddy and cold. They were huddled in the small, cramped attic. The air was stifling. Lily was shivering in her sleep, the fever holding tight. Rosa sat with her knees pulled to her chest, clutching a notebook. Tommy sat beside her, drawing furious dark scribbles with a charcoal pencil. Maggie sat near the small attic window, watching the world drown. She had a flashlight, 3 jugs of water, a medical kit, and her late husband's .30-06 hunting rifle leaning against the wall. But no boat, no phone signal, no way out. The sun didn't rise, it just got a little less dark. The rain continued to hammer the roof. The river was a roar in her ears. Then she saw it. Maggie squinted through the rain-streaked glass. Out in the churning brown water, a shadow. She wiped the glass furiously with her sleeve. It wasn't debris, it was a horse, a massive pitch-black horse, fighting the current. And there was a man on its back. Maggie's breath hitched. The water was moving with terrifying speed, sweeping up uprooted trees and fence posts. But the rider wasn't being swept away. He was fighting. He was steering that massive horse directly against the current, forcing the animal to push through the chest-deep rapids. He was riding toward them, deliberately. Maggie grabbed the rifle. She didn't know who was crazy enough to ride into a flood, but out here, a stranger appearing when you were vulnerable wasn't always a blessing. She climbed down the pull-down stairs, the cold, muddy water soaking her boots immediately. She waded to the front door. The water was up to her shins inside the cabin. She pushed the door open just as the black horse reached the porch. The animal was magnificent but exhausted, its sides heaving, nostrils flared. The man slid off the saddle, landing in knee-deep water on the porch. He was soaked to the bone, a weathered face. Dark, intense eyes beneath a dripping Stetson. A thick beard. Maggie raised the rifle. She pressed the stock tight to her shoulder. She knew him. Everyone in the county knew him. "Stop right there, McRae," Maggie shouted over the roar of the river. Eli McRae, the outcast, the man who had been convicted of land fraud 5 years ago. He was a pariah, a man the whole town crossed the street to avoid. Eli froze. He looked at the barrel of the gun. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't look afraid. He just looked tired. "Put the gun away, Mrs. Calloway," Eli said. His voice was deep, gravelly. It carried easily over the storm. "Give me one good reason," Maggie yelled back, her finger resting near the trigger. "You've got no business being here. Everyone knows what you are." Eli took a slow, deliberate breath. The water swirled violently around his boots. "I'll give you the only reason that matters," Eli said, staring directly into her eyes. He didn't shout, but his words hit like a hammer. "The water is shifting. The main levee upriver is breaking. This whole valley is about to be under 10 feet of water." Maggie didn't lower the gun. "That doesn't explain why you're here." "I was on high ground," Eli said, his voice steady, rhythmic. "I was safe. But I saw the river change course, and I knew a widow and 3 orphaned kids had just moved into this low-ground cabin." Eli took one step closer. The tip of the rifle was only inches from his chest. "Now, listen to me closely, Margaret," Eli said, his tone turning fiercely serious. It wasn't a plea. It was a demand for human decency. "You are pointing a gun at me because of what the town says I am, because of a ruined reputation. But a person's dignity and their right to live are not decided by gossip or a judge's gavel. Those children up there have a fundamental basic right to survive this night, and I have the right to try and save them." Maggie stared at him. Her arms were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of his words. "I am not going to let a family drown tonight just because society thinks I'm a monster," Eli continued, his eyes blazing with a quiet, undeniable truth. "Every human being deserves an equal chance at life. No one is worth less than anyone else. Not you, not those kids, and not me. So you have a choice. You can judge me for a past you don't understand, or you can lower that rifle and let me help you get those kids to the roof before this house goes under." The wind howled. The horse snorted, stamping its hoof in the muddy water. Maggie looked at his eyes. She had seen men lie. She had seen men break. But she had never seen a man look down the barrel of a gun and demand respect for the value of human life. She thought of Rose's fear. She thought of Tommy's silence. She thought of Lily, burning with fever in the dark. Slowly, Maggie lowered the barrel of the rifle. "If you make one wrong move," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Eli nodded once, a short, respectful dip of his chin. "You won't have to worry about me, ma'am. We have a lot of work to do." He stepped past the threshold, bringing the storm in with him. Maggie turned, wading through the flooded living room, knowing she had just let the devil into her home. But as she watched him immediately begin assessing the structural integrity of the ceiling, she realized something else. Sometimes, when the whole world is trying to drown you, the devil is the only one who knows how to swim. The attic was no bigger than a horse stall. It smelled of old dust, damp wood, and fear. The roof slanted sharply, pressing down on them. Outside, the rain beat against the shingles like a drum. It was a relentless, punishing rhythm. Below them, the cabin groaned. The water was tearing at the foundation. Eli McRae didn't waste time. He came up through the trapdoor, dripping wet. He didn't ask for a towel. He didn't look for a place to sit. He just stood up, his head brushing the center beam, and started assessing the wood. "Ridge beam is sagging," Eli said. His voice was low, calm. "The water is pushing the walls inward. We need to brace the cross ties." He didn't wait for Maggie to agree. He moved to the far corner. He started pulling apart an old, heavy oak bed frame that had been left up there to rot. His hands moved fast, sure. The hands of a man who had spent his life fixing things that were broken. Maggie watched him. She held Lily tight against her chest. The little girl's fever was a dry, radiating heat. "Tommy," Maggie said softly, "hand me the wet cloth." Tommy didn't make a sound. He just crawled over, holding out a piece of torn flannel soaked in water. Maggie laid it across Lily's forehead. Tommy retreated to the corner. He pulled his knees up to his chin. He opened his sketchbook. Rosa was sitting on a plastic storage bin. Her arms were crossed, her jaw was locked tight. She was glaring at Eli's back. It was a heavy, suffocating silence in that tiny space. The only sounds were the howling wind, the rush of the river below, and the sharp crack of wood as Eli broke the bed frame apart. He found some rusted nails in an old coffee can. He used the heel of his heavy leather boot to hammer the oak slats against the sagging roof beam. Bang, bang, bang. "I don't want him up here," Rosa said. Her voice was sharp. It cut right through the noise of the storm. Eli paused. The hammer boot hovered in the air for a second. Then he brought it down on the nail. He didn't turn around. He just kept working. Maggie looked up. "Rosa, stop!" "No," Rosa said. Her voice climbed higher. It was shaking. 11 years old, filled with grief and looking for a target. "I know who he is. Everybody at school talks about him. Mr. Holt says he's a thief. He's a crook. He belongs in jail. Why did you let him in our house?" Eli struck the nail one last time. He lowered his boot. He stood very still in the dim shadows of the attic. He didn't defend himself. He was used to the hate. He had worn it like a heavy coat for 5 years. Maggie set Lily down gently on the blanket. She stood up. The ceiling was low, so she had to stoop a little. She walked over to Rosa. She didn't look angry. She looked dead serious. She knelt so she was eye level with the girl. "Look at me, Rosa," Maggie said. Rosa blinked, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Maggie kept her voice steady, rhythmic. She made sure every single word landed. "In this house, we do not judge a person by town gossip," Maggie said clearly. "We judge a person by how they act when things get hard. Listen to me very carefully, Rosa. Everyone is born with the right to be respected. Human dignity is a birthright. It is not something you have to earn, and it is not something that a rumor can take away. You give respect until a person's own actions prove they don't deserve it." Rosa looked down at her hands. "Look at me," Maggie repeated gently. Rosa looked up. "Mr. Eli just risked his life," Maggie said, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "He rode a horse into a flood that is tearing trees out by the roots. He did it for us. He is up here right now, fixing the roof over your head so we don't drown. That makes him an honorable man, and an honorable man deserves your respect. Do you understand me?" The attic was quiet. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Rosa swallowed hard. The anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by the deep, hollow sadness of a child who just missed her mother. She nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Maggie said. She reached out and squeezed Rosa's knee. In the corner, Eli turned around. His face was unreadable in the dark, but his chest rose and fell in a deep, shaky breath. No one had spoken up for him in 5 years. No one. He looked at Maggie just for a second. He gave her a single silent nod. Maggie nodded back. The hours dragged on. The sun went down, plunging the attic into pitch blackness. Maggie clicked on the single battery-powered lantern. It cast a weak, yellow circle of light on the floorboards. The water had reached the first-floor ceiling. They could hear it slapping against the wood right beneath them. Maggie finally got Lily to swallow some crushed fever medicine. The little girl drifted off into a restless sleep. Rosa curled up in a blanket, exhausted by her own emotions. Eli sat by the attic window. He kept watch. His hat was pulled low over his eyes. He was watching the dark water, waiting for it to breach the trapdoor. Tommy was still awake. The 7-year-old boy hadn't slept. He had been drawing for hours by the faint light of the lantern. Suddenly he stood up. He walked across the creaking floorboards. He stopped right in front of Eli. Eli looked down. Tommy held out a piece of paper torn from his sketchbook. Eli took it carefully. His large, calloused hands held the paper to the lantern light. It was a drawing done in dark charcoal. A massive black horse. It was standing in swirling, chaotic water, but the horse looked strong, unbreakable. Eli felt a tight knot form in his throat. He looked at the boy. Tommy's eyes were wide, staring right back at him, waiting. Eli didn't try to force a smile. He didn't talk to Tommy like a baby. He spoke to him man to man. "Thank you, son," Eli said. His voice was a low rumble. "This is a fine drawing, a very fine drawing." Tommy didn't smile, but he didn't run away. He just stood there. "Your mama passed away recently," Eli said softly. He didn't beat around the bush. "And you haven't spoken a word since. I know why. It's because the pain is too loud right now. It takes up all the space in your head." Tommy's lower lip trembled, just a fraction. Eli leaned forward. He made sure the boy heard the next words clearly. "I need you to know something," Eli said, stating it as a hard, undeniable fact. "No one expects you to find the words when your heart is broken. Your silence is not a problem that needs fixing. You have the right to process your grief in your own time. But I want you to know that your presence right here, your courage to just be in this room, is a powerful voice all on its own. You are heard, Tommy. Even without words, you are heard." A single tear spilled over Tommy's eyelashes. It tracked down his dirty cheek. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stepped forward, wrapped his small arms around Eli's thick, damp canvas jacket, and buried his face in the man's shoulder. Eli closed his eyes. He wrapped one massive arm around the boy, holding him steady in the dark. Across the room, Maggie watched them. Her chest ached. She realized then that Eli McRae wasn't just fixing the broken boards of the cabin. He was fixing the broken things inside her family. Morning didn't bring the sun. It just brought a gray, sickening light. Maggie opened the trap door. She looked down. The first floor of the cabin was gone. Just a pool of dark, muddy water swirling at the top step of the stairs. Pieces of furniture bumped blindly against the walls, a wooden chair, a sofa cushion. They were completely cut off, marooned in the sky. Maggie closed the hatch. She sat back on her heels and wiped the sweat from her face. The air was thick and humid. Eli was already awake. He had been awake all night. He was sitting cross-legged, sorting through the meager supplies Maggie had brought up. 2 cans of beans, a box of crackers, 3 bottles of water. "It's not much," Maggie said. "It's enough," Eli replied, "if we're smart." He looked up at her. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but they were sharp, alert. "We need to get some things straight, Mrs. Calloway," Eli said. "Maggie," she corrected him. "Just Maggie." Eli nodded. "Maggie, we're going to be up here for a few days. The river is cresting, but it'll take time to recede. I will do everything in my power to keep you and these kids safe. That is a promise." "I know," Maggie said. She meant it. "But I need to say something," Eli continued. His tone shifted. It lost its gentle edge and became something harder. Proud. "I am helping you because it is the right thing to do. I am doing this out of basic human decency. I am not doing this to buy my way back into society's good graces. I am not doing this to atone for a crime I did not commit." Maggie stayed quiet. She listened. She owed him that. "I don't have a dime to my name," Eli said, his voice steady and rhythmic. "I don't have a house anymore. The river took it last night. But I need you to understand this. I may be poor, and I may be a pariah in this county. But in this room, my dignity is equal to anyone else's. I am a free man, and I expect to be treated as an equal, not as a charity case, not as a criminal." Maggie looked at the hard lines of his face. She saw the years of rejection etched around his eyes. "You are an equal in this house, Eli," Maggie said clearly. She didn't hesitate. "You have my respect, entirely. We are a team until this water goes down." "Fair enough," Eli said. The tension in his shoulders dropped. Just a fraction. "Now," Eli said, standing up, "we have a leak on the west gable. Wind blew some shingles off. Water's coming in. I need to rig a tarp over the gap from the inside, or everything we have left is going to get soaked." He pulled a folded blue tarp and a length of nylon rope from his canvas bag. "I need an extra pair of hands," Eli said. He looked at Maggie. "But you need to tend to the little one." Lily was awake, but she was fussy. Her fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak and clingy. Maggie couldn't leave her. Eli looked across the attic. Rosa was sitting by herself, tracing patterns in the dust on the floorboards. "Rosa!" Eli called out. Rosa looked up, suspicious. "I need your help," Eli said. Rosa frowned. "I don't know how to fix a roof." "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to help me tie off this tarp, Eli said. He held out the rope. Come here. Rosa hesitated. She looked at Maggie. Maggie gave her an encouraging nod. Slowly, Rosa stood up and walked over. She still kept a foot of distance between them. Grab that end of the tarp, Eli instructed. Hold it tight against the wall stud, right there. Rosa held the blue plastic against the wood. Her arms were skinny, but she pushed hard. Good, Eli said. He took the rope. Now we need to tie a bowline knot. It's a ranch knot. It won't slip, no matter how much the wind pulls on this tarp. Watch my hands. Eli looped the rope. He moved slowly. Make a hole. The rabbit comes out of the hole, goes around the tree, and back down the hole, see? He pulled it tight. A perfect, strong knot. Now, you do it on your side, Eli said. He handed her the other end of the rope. Rosa took the rope. She tried to mimic his movements. She made a loop. She pushed the end through. But she got tangled. She pulled it tight, and the whole thing collapsed into a messy, useless knot. No, Eli said gently. You went under the standing part, not over. Try again. Rosa gritted her teeth. She undid the mess. She tried again. Her fingers were clumsy. Her frustration was rising. She pushed the rope through, jerked it hard, and the knot slipped right out of her hands. The tarp flapped wildly in the wind, slapping her in the face. Rosa snapped. She threw the rope on the floor, her hands balled into fists. I can't do it, Rosa yelled. Tears of sheer frustration spilled down her cheeks. It's stupid. I don't know how to do ranch stuff. I'm just a kid and everything is ruined. The house is ruined. My mom is gone. Everything is gone. She stood there, chest heaving, waiting to be yelled at. Waiting to be told to quiet down. Eli didn't yell. He didn't look annoyed. He stooped down and picked up the rope. He wiped the dust off it. Then he stood up and looked Rosa dead in the eye. Anger is your right, Rosa, Eli said. His voice cut through the wind. It was powerful, grounding. You have every right to be furious. You lost your mother. The world has been incredibly unfair to you. That anger inside you, it is valid. It is real. Rosa sniffled, caught off guard. She rubbed her eyes. But, Eli said, stepping closer, holding the rope out to her, you do not have the right to use that anger as an excuse to give up on yourself. You cannot let your pain turn you into a victim. He placed the rope back into her hands. You learn this knot, Eli told her, his voice full of fierce belief. You learn how to survive. Because education and knowledge are the only things in this world that make a person truly free. People can take your house. They can take your money. They can even take your family. But nobody can take what you know. Knowledge is your power, Rosa. Don't throw it on the floor. Now, make the loop. Rosa stared at him. Her tears stopped falling. She looked down at the rope in her hands. She took a deep breath. She made the loop. The rabbit comes out of the hole, Rosa whispered. That's right, Eli said quietly. Around the tree, she said, wrapping the end over the line. And back down. She pulled. The knot snapped into place. Tight. Perfect. Unmoving. I did it, Rosa said. A small, proud smile broke through the grime on her face. Yes, you did, Eli said. He reached up and tugged the tarp. It held fast against the storm. Good job, Hand. From her spot on the floor, Maggie watched them. She watched the outcast cowboy treating an angry orphan with more respect and dignity than the rest of the world had ever shown him. Maggie felt something shift inside her chest. A hard shell she had built around her heart over the last 3 years suddenly cracked. Just a little. She realized, looking at Eli McRae, that salvation didn't just come from high ground. Sometimes it came from the people who had survived the deepest waters. The rain finally stopped on the 3rd afternoon. It didn't end with a slow drizzle. It just quit, like someone had turned off a faucet in the sky. The silence that followed was heavy. It rang in their ears. The water had stopped rising, but it hadn't gone down. The cabin was an island in a sea of muddy brown. Eli was sitting near the attic window when he heard it. A low, steady hum. He leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. "Boat," Eli said. Maggie hurried to the glass. She wiped away the condensation. Out on the water, cutting through the floating branches and debris, was a flat-bottomed aluminum motorboat. There were 3 men in it. 2 were ranch hands wearing yellow slickers. The man sitting in the middle wasn't wearing a slicker. He wore a heavy canvas coat. A clean silver-belly Stetson. He wasn't wet. He didn't look tired. Raymond Holt. Maggie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Raymond Holt owned half of Crockett County. He was running for the Texas Land Board. And he was the man who had bought the land out from under Maggie's landlord just 2 months ago. The boat bumped against the submerged porch of the cabin. "Margaret!" Holt's voice boomed over the water. It was a big, friendly voice, the kind of voice that won elections. "Margaret Calloway, you folks all right in there?" Maggie pushed open the attic window. The damp air rushed in. "We're fine, Mr. Holt," Maggie called out. Her voice was steady. "Just waiting on the water to drop." Holt looked up at the window. He smiled. It was a warm, practiced smile. "I was worried sick," Holt said, shaking his head. "When I heard the FM 2400 washed out, I knew you and those poor orphans were stuck. I brought fresh water and some hot food." He motioned to the ranch hands. They held up a couple of insulated coolers. "That's very kind of you," Maggie said. "It's just neighborly," Holt said smoothly. He leaned back in the boat. He looked at the water lapping against the cabin. "Listen, Margaret, this place is a total loss. The county is going to condemn it, but I can't sleep at night knowing those kids don't have a home." He paused, let the silence hang. "I have a vacant house in town," Holt continued. "High ground, safe, 3 bedrooms. I want you to have it, rent-free, for a whole year." Maggie stared down at him. It was a lifeline, a miracle. "There's just one little piece of paperwork," Holt said. He pulled a dry leather folder from his coat. "You just need to sign over the remainder of your lease on this cabin to me, right now. Today. So I can get my crews in here to start a community drainage project. For the good of the whole county, you understand." Maggie looked at the leather folder. Then she looked at Holt's clean hat. Nobody gives away a house for free, not in West Texas. Before Maggie could answer, Holt's eyes shifted. He looked past Maggie into the dark of the attic. He saw the shadow of the man standing behind her. Holt's friendly smile vanished. His face went hard, cold. "Well now," Holt said. His voice wasn't booming anymore, it was sharp. "I see you've taken in stray dogs, Margaret. Did you know you're harboring a convicted felon? Eli McRae is a thief. He stole from this county. I'm calling the sheriff the minute I hit dry land. I can't leave those innocent children in a house with a criminal." Eli didn't step out of the shadows. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, letting the rich man's words wash over him. He was used to it. He was used to, but Maggie wasn't. She felt the heat rise in her chest. She remembered Eli pulling the kids onto the roof. She remembered him fixing the rafters. Maggie leaned out the window. She didn't shout. She spoke with a razor-sharp clarity. "Mr. Holt," Maggie said, "listen to me very carefully. Generosity that requires stripping someone of their property isn't charity. It is exploitation. You are using my desperation to steal this land." Holt's jaw tightened. "Margaret, I'm trying to help you." "No, you aren't," Maggie said. She pointed a finger down at him. "And using your power and your money to trample a man who isn't in a position to speak up for himself, that is cowardice. Mr. Eli risked his life to save my family. You just rowed a boat out here to steal my lease. Keep your food, keep your water. We aren't going anywhere." Holt stared at her. His eyes were like chipped ice. "You're making a mistake, widow," Holt said quietly. "A very big mistake." He signaled his men. The boat engine roared to life. They turned around and headed back toward town, leaving the coolers on the submerged porch. Maggie closed the window. Her hands were shaking. She turned around. Eli was looking at her. He looked stunned. "You shouldn't have done that," Eli said softly. "You need that house." I don't need a house bought with dirty money, Maggie said. She sat down on a crate. Tell me the truth, Eli, right now. What does he want with this land? Eli took a deep breath. He sat down across from her. He wants the river access, Eli said flatly. 5 years ago, Holt started quietly buying up all the land along the Pecos. He's building a private water pipeline to sell county water to the fracking companies out west. It's a multi-million-dollar deal. And your land? Maggie asked. My cabin was right in the middle of his route, Eli said. I wouldn't sell, so he found a judge he owned. They claimed the deed my grandfather left me was forged. They called it land fraud. They took the land, and they put me in a cell for 18 months to keep me quiet. Maggie looked at him. She didn't look for a lie. She knew the truth when she heard it. I see, Maggie said quietly. I don't have any proof, Eli said, looking down at his boots. Nobody believed me then. Nobody will believe me now. That's where you're wrong, Maggie said. Her eyes flickered with a sudden fierce light. We just have to know where to look. The morning of the 4th day brought the sun. It broke through the clouds, hot and blinding. The water outside began to steam. The smell of mud and rotting vegetation filled the attic. But the water level finally dropped a few inches. The top step of the staircase was visible again. Maggie sat by the window. She had a small, cheap solar charging bank she'd dug out of a camping box. She pressed it against the glass, letting the sun hit the panels. It took 3 hours to get her phone to a 4% charge. Eli was across the attic, whittling a piece of scrap wood for Tommy. He watched Maggie plug the cord into her cracked phone. The screen flickered to life. She had 1 bar of signal. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't call FEMA. She dialed a number from memory. David? Maggie said when the line picked up. Her voice changed. It wasn't the tired widow anymore. It was sharp, professional. It's Maggie Calloway. Yes, it's been a long time. Listen to me. I need you to pull the federal environmental permits for Crockett County. Specifically, anything filed by Holt Enterprises for a private pipeline crossing the Pecos. Eli stopped whittling. He looked up. I know it's state land, Maggie said into the phone, but if his pipe crosses the riverbed, he needs a Federal Army Corps of Engineers permit. Check the dates. See if they line up with the county land seizures from 5 years ago. I think we have a pattern of illegal eminent domain. She listened for a moment. She nodded. Just get the files, David. I'll call you back when the road's clear. She hung up. The phone screen died immediately. Battery exhausted. Maggie let out a long breath. She turned around. Eli was staring at her. You know land law, Eli said. It wasn't a question. Maggie offered a small, tired smile. Before I met my husband, I spent 2 years in Austin. I worked for the Texas Land Rights Advocacy Group. We were a non-profit. We fought big corporations trying to bully small ranchers off their property. Eli slowly put his knife away. You were a lawyer? Paralegal and lead investigator, Maggie said. She leaned back against the wall. I loved that job. I believed in it. Why did you quit? Eli asked. Because I met Daniel, Maggie said softly. He was a deputy here in Crockett County. Then he got hurt in a car wreck. I quit my job, moved out here and became a nurse so I could take care of him. I gave up fighting the system so I could take care of the man I loved. She looked down at her hands. And then he died anyway. Eli didn't offer a hollow apology. He just nodded, understanding the bitter math of loss. I know the men who took your land, Eli, Maggie said, looking back up. Not them personally, but men just like them. I know how they operate. They rely on you feeling small. I was small, Eli said. I was just a ranch hand. I didn't have money for fancy lawyers. Maggie sat forward, her eyes locked onto his. Listen to me, Eli, Maggie said. Her voice was firm. She made sure every word hung in the quiet air of the attic. Do you know why you lost 5 years ago? Because you thought justice would speak for itself. You thought that just being innocent was enough. Eli looked away. It should be. It should, Maggie agreed. But it isn't. The law exists to protect human rights, Eli. It was written to protect men like you from men like Raymond Holt. But the law is just words on paper until somebody picks it up and uses it. It only works when we are brave enough to wield it. She pointed to the dead phone in her hand. We are not going to fight Holt with our bare hands, Maggie said, and we are not going to run away. We are going to use the very legal system he corrupted, and we are going to disarm him with it. We are going to find the federal permits he didn't file. We are going to expose the land fraud. But you have to be willing to stand up and fight. Eli looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw a woman who had lost her husband, who was fighting to keep 3 orphaned kids, and who was sitting in a flooded attic. Yet she looked completely unbreakable. I'm tired of running, Maggie, Eli said quietly. Tell me what to do. Behind them, sitting on her sleeping bag, Rosa was holding her notebook. She had been listening to every word. She opened to a blank page. She picked up her pen. She didn't write in Spanish today. She wrote in English, pressing the pen hard into the paper. Today, Mama Maggie taught me something important. She said the law is for protecting people, but it doesn't work if you stay quiet. When bad people try to take away your rights, staying quiet doesn't make you a good person. It just means you surrender. We are not going to surrender. Rosa looked up from her notebook. She looked at Eli, then at Maggie. For the first time since the flood started, Rosa didn't feel scared. She felt ready. The water finally started to retreat on the 6th day. It went down inch by agonizing inch. It left behind a thick, foul-smelling layer of brown mud on everything it touched. The first floor of the cabin was a wreck. Swollen floorboards, overturned chairs, watermarks stained the walls like dirty rings in a bathtub. But they were alive. Late that afternoon, a sharp, panicked whinny cut through the quiet. Eli was on his feet instantly. He climbed down from the attic, his boots splashing into the ankle-deep muck of the living room. He waded out the front door. Maggie followed him to the landing, her heart in her throat. Out on the porch, dusk was thrashing. The massive black horse had survived the flood tied to the heavy porch pillars. But as the water receded, it had left behind a tangled mess of debris. A thick coil of rusted barbed wire, washed down from some upriver fence line, was wrapped tightly around Dusk's left front leg. The horse pulled against it, the wire bit deeper. Blood trickled down the wet hide. Easy, boy, Eli murmured. His voice was a low, steady rumble. Easy now, don't fight it. Eli moved slow. He didn't rush. He waded into the muddy water, keeping his hands where the horse could see them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy pair of wire cutters. Behind Maggie, a small shadow crept down the stairs. It was Tommy. The 7-year-old boy stood on the bottom step. His eyes were wide. He stared at the horse. He watched the blood mix with the muddy water on the porch boards. He watched the animal's chest heave in panic. Eli knelt in the water. He worked the cutters. Snap, snap, the wire fell away. Dusk let out a long, shuddering breath and stamped his hoof. Tommy took one step off the stairs. His bare feet touched the cold mud. He didn't look at Maggie. He looked straight at the horse and then at Eli. Tommy opened his mouth. His throat worked, and for the first time in 6 weeks, a sound came out. Hurts. It was just one word. It was rough, scratched, like a rusty hinge swinging open. Eli froze. He didn't jump up. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just turned his head slowly and looked at the boy. Yeah, Eli said. His voice was incredibly gentle. It hurts. Eli stood up. He walked over to Tommy, the muddy water sloshing around his boots. He crouched down so he was right at the boy's eye level. Listen to me, Tommy, Eli said, stating it clearly and firmly. Acknowledging the pain is the very first step to making it stop. Hiding it doesn't make it go away. It's okay to say it out loud. You have the right to feel your pain, and you have the right to tell people when you are hurting. Tommy stared at him. Then, very slowly, the little boy nodded. He reached out a small hand. Eli took it, guiding the boy forward. Together they walked over to the horse. Tommy placed his small, pale hand on Dusk's thick neck. The horse lowered his head, breathing warm air against the boy's hair. For the first time since his mother died, Tommy looked peaceful. Night fell. The cabin was damp and cold. The kids were asleep in the attic, wrapped in every dry blanket Maggie could find. Maggie sat on a wooden crate in the kitchen. She had a small flashlight aimed at the table. She was looking at her hands. They were a mess. Cracked knuckles, splinters, blisters that had popped and bled. The damp, dirty water had infected the cuts. They throbbed with a dull, constant ache. She tried to flex her fingers, wincing as the skin pulled tight. She heard a footstep. Eli walked into the kitchen. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He just pulled up a chair across from her. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small glass jar. Coconut oil and beeswax. A rancher's salve. He unscrewed the lid. The smell of coconut filled the damp air. Eli reached across the table. He took her right hand. Maggie flinched. She tried to pull her hand back. It was pure instinct. A reflex built over 3 years of carrying every burden completely alone. "I'm fine," Maggie said quickly. "It's just a few scratches." Eli didn't let go. His grip wasn't tight, but it was unyielding, warm. "Stop," Eli said softly. "Stop fighting." Maggie looked up at him. The dim flashlight caught the deep lines around his eyes. "Listen to me, Maggie," Eli said. The rhythm of his voice slowed down. He made sure she heard the weight of every word. "Independence is a fine trait. It kept you alive. But refusing help when you're completely exhausted isn't strength. It's cruelty to yourself." Maggie's throat felt tight. "I have to be the strong one. If I fall apart, they have nothing." "You don't have to be a stone wall to be strong," Eli replied, his thumb gently rubbing a dollop of salve over her bruised knuckles. "You spend your entire life caring for everyone else. But equality means letting yourself be cared for just as fiercely as you care for them. Allow me to exercise the most basic human right tonight. The right to give love and care to someone who needs it." Maggie stopped pulling away. She let her hand rest in his. The salve was cool. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of hard labor, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He worked the oil into her cracked skin, slow and deliberate. Maggie watched his hands. She felt a tear hot on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She had been a widow for 3 years, a nurse for 20, a mother to 3 orphans for 6 weeks. But right now, sitting in a ruined kitchen in the dark, she was just a woman. And for the very first time in a long time, someone was holding her. The morning of the 7th day brought the sound of tires on gravel. The water had receded enough to leave FM 2400 passable. It was a scarred, gutted mess of deep ruts and thick brown mud. But it was a road again. Maggie stood on the porch. She watched a white Ford SUV crawl up the driveway. Her stomach turned to lead. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't FEMA. The logo on the side of the door read, "Texas Department of Family and Protective Services." A woman stepped out. She wore a sensible gray suit and sensible black shoes that were immediately ruined by the mud. She held a metal clipboard against her chest like a shield. Patricia Walsh, Maggie's assigned caseworker. Patricia picked her way across the yard. She looked at the debris. She looked at the mud-caked walls of the cabin. Then she looked at Maggie. "Margaret," Patricia said. There was no warmth in her voice, just the tired exhaustion of a bureaucrat. "We got an anonymous tip yesterday afternoon, before the phone lines went down. They said you were trapped out here." Maggie stepped to the edge of the porch. "We had a flood, Patricia. It was unexpected. But the children are safe. They are dry, and they are fed." Patricia wrote something on her clipboard. She didn't look up. An anonymous caller from Mr. Holt's office stated you were refusing evacuation and that you were exposing the children to hazardous conditions. Patricia finally looked up. Her eyes drifted past Maggie. Eli was standing in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands. He looked exactly like what he was. A rough, weathered ranch hand who had just spent 6 days fighting a river. Patricia's eyes narrowed. She recognized him. Everyone who worked for the county recognized him. "Margaret," Patricia said, her voice dropping an octave. "Is that Eli McRae?" "He saved our lives," Maggie said immediately. Her voice was sharp, protective. "He got us to the roof. He kept the roof from caving in." Patricia shook her head. Her pen flew across the paper on the clipboard. "He is a convicted felon," Patricia said flatly. "You are harboring a man with a criminal record in a condemned, flooded structure with 3 traumatized orphans. I am documenting a severe lapse in judgment. I am recommending a temporary suspension of custody pending the hearing." Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. "You can't do that. You know Holt set him up. You know Holt is trying to steal this land." "I don't know anything about land," Patricia said, turning back toward her SUV. "I know about child safety regulations. I'll see you in court, Margaret, if you still have a case." Patricia got in the car. She backed down the muddy driveway and drove away. The silence that fell over the cabin was deafening. Maggie turned around. Eli was standing by the kitchen table. He was looking down at his phone. The cell towers were finally back up. His screen was glowing brightly in the dim room. Maggie walked inside. She felt hollowed out. She walked past the table and glanced down at his screen. It was a text message from an unsaved number. "Warrant still active. Holt filed for trespassing on the river track 2 days ago. If you are still on that lease, the sheriff is coming to arrest you. Get out now." The timestamp on the text wasn't from this morning. It was from the night before. Maggie stopped. She stared at the screen. Then she looked up at Eli. He wasn't hiding the phone. He was just looking at her, his jaw set tight. "You got a signal last night," Maggie said. Her voice was dangerously quiet. "Just for a few minutes," Eli said. "A buddy of mine works at the courthouse. He texted me." "You knew," Maggie said. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "You knew Holt put out a warrant for you. You knew you were trespassing just by standing here. And you didn't tell me." "I couldn't leave," Eli said. He stepped forward. His voice was urgent, desperate. "The water was still too high. The roof was still leaking. If I told you, you would have made me leave. And I couldn't leave you and those kids alone in the dark." "That was not your choice to make," Maggie yelled. The sound of her voice echoed off the damp walls. Upstairs, she heard the floorboards creak. The kids were listening. Eli stepped back as if she had struck him. "I was protecting you," Eli said quietly. "No, you were managing me," Maggie snapped. Her chest heaved. The betrayal burned hotter than the fear of losing the kids. "Listen to me, Eli. I have the right to know the truth. Care without transparency is just control. You do not get to decide what is safe for my family without me." Eli stared at her. The stubborn pride in his eyes began to fracture. "My husband used to do the exact same thing," Maggie said, her voice shaking. "He kept secrets to protect me. True respect means giving someone the truth, even when it's scary, so they can make their own choices. When you hid that warrant from me, you robbed me of my agency. You took away my right to protect my own family." The words hung in the air, heavy, final. Eli looked down at his muddy boots. He understood. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had treated her like something fragile that needed saving, instead of treating her like an equal partner. "You're right," Eli said. His voice was a hollow rasp. "I'm sorry." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He walked over to the corner, picked up his damp canvas bag, and slung it over his shoulder. He walked to the front door. He didn't look back. He waded through the mud, untied Dusk from the porch pillar, and swung up into the saddle. The black horse splashed through the muck, heading down the ruined road toward Sanderson. Maggie stood in the doorway and watched him go. Behind her, Tommy came halfway down the stairs. The little boy held his sketchbook. He looked at the empty porch. He looked at Maggie. Then, Tommy slowly closed the sketchbook. He turned around and walked back up into the dark attic. The pages remained completely blank. The mud was thick. It caked the tires of Maggie's old Ford truck, trying to pull her down into the earth. But she kept her foot on the gas. It was the morning of the 9th day. The floodwaters were gone, leaving behind a scarred, ugly landscape. Maggie drove down FM 2400. The road was a mess of deep ruts and washed-out gravel. She didn't care. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tight. In the rearview mirror, she could see Rosa, Tommy, and Lily strapped into the back seat. They were quiet, waiting. Maggie was done waiting. She drove 45 miles into the small town of Sanderson. It wasn't much of a town. A gas station, a feed store, a diner with a flickering neon sign. She found Eli parked behind the feed store. He was leaning against the tailgate of a rusted, beat-up Chevy truck that belonged to somebody else. Dusk was tied to a hitching post nearby, eating hay from a canvas bag. Eli looked hollowed out. He was holding a cup of black coffee, staring at the dirt. Maggie threw the Ford into park. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the morning heat. Eli looked up. He didn't move. He just watched her walk toward him. Maggie stopped a few feet away. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad, either. She looked like a woman who had drawn a line in the sand. "I was right to be angry with you," Maggie said. Her voice was calm, steady. "You were wrong to hide the truth from me. We are free, equal adults. We don't keep secrets to manage each other." Eli lowered his coffee cup. "I know. I crossed a line. I thought leaving was the best way to keep you safe. But it wasn't your choice to make," Maggie said firmly. "You don't walk away from a partner just because things get hard. And you don't run away from a fight just because you're used to losing." Eli looked at her. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Maggie, Holt has a warrant out for me. I can't protect you from a jail cell." Maggie walked over to the hood of his truck. She unrolled a manila folder she had carried under her arm. She spread the papers out on the warm metal. "Come here," she said. Eli set his coffee down. He walked over. He looked at the papers. They were highlighted, covered in Maggie's neat handwriting. "I've been on the phone since the cell towers came back up," Maggie said, tapping a thick document. "This is a contact at the Texas Rivers Protection Coalition. They've been trying to nail Holt for illegal water diversion for years. They just needed a local witness." She tapped the next page. "This is a reporter from the San Antonio Express-News. She covers political corruption in the Big Bend area. She wants to run a story on Holt's land grabs. And this," Maggie tapped a list of names, "is a list of 5 other ranchers in Crockett County. Holt threatened them too. They were scared to speak up, but I called them. They are ready to sign a petition." Eli stared at the papers. He couldn't breathe. "Maggie," Eli whispered, "you spent the last 2 days doing this?" "I did," she said. "Why?" His voice cracked. It was a raw, painful sound. "Why put yourself in the crosshairs for me?" Maggie looked him dead in the eye. This was the moment. The truth she needed him and her children to hear. "Because restoring the dignity of an honest man isn't an act of charity, Eli," Maggie said. Her words rang clear across the empty dirt lot. "It is the execution of justice. Every single person has the fundamental right to be treated fairly under the law. Holt stole your rights. He used the system to make you feel worthless. But your worth was never tied to his lies." Eli closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his weathered face. "I am doing this," Maggie continued, her voice full of fierce conviction, "because my children are watching. They have suffered. They have seen the world be incredibly unfair. They need to see their mother fight for what is right. They need to know that standing up for the rights of the oppressed is our duty as human beings. I want them to know how to fight for themselves when the time comes." She reached out and put her hand over his. "You are not a stray dog, Eli. Maggie said softly. "You are a good man, and good men deserve to be fought for." Eli opened his eyes. He looked down at her hand covering his. He had spent 5 years believing he was completely alone. He had accepted the exile. Behind them, a truck door opened. Eli looked up. Rosa stepped out of the Ford. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked determined. She walked across the dirt lot and stood right beside Maggie. Then Tommy climbed out. He held Lily's hand. The two of them walked over and stood on the other side of Eli. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, a united front. Eli looked at the 3 orphans. He looked at the widow who had refused to break. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his past finally begin to fracture and fall away. He took a deep breath of the dry Texas air. "All right," Eli said. His voice was thick, but it was steady. He squeezed Maggie's hand. "Where do we start?" 3 weeks passed. They were hard weeks, loud weeks. Maggie's living room became a war room. Papers were stacked on the dining table. The reporter from San Antonio came out and took pictures of the flooded cabin. She interviewed Eli. She interviewed the other ranchers. When the article hit the front page of the Sunday paper, the county exploded. Holt's campaign for the land board froze. The Environmental Coalition filed a federal injunction to halt his pipeline. The local judge who had signed Eli's conviction suddenly announced his early retirement. The bully was finally backed into a corner. It was a Tuesday evening when the phone rang. Maggie answered it. It was David, her lawyer friend in Austin. She listened for 10 minutes. She didn't say much, just, "Are you sure?" and "Send me the copies." When she hung up, her hands were shaking. Eli was outside on the porch fixing a broken floorboard. Maggie walked out. The sun was going down, painting the sky in strokes of violent orange and bruised purple. "Eli," Maggie said. He put his hammer down. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "What is it? Did Holt file a countersuit?" "No," Maggie said. She walked over and sat on the porch railing. She held a printed email in her hand. David found the original deeds in the state archives, the real ones, not the copies the county had on file. Eli frowned. "And?" Maggie took a deep breath. "The land Holt accused you of stealing 5 years ago, the parcel by the river. You didn't forge a deed to get it." "I know I didn't," Eli said firmly. "I just lived there." "Eli," Maggie said softly, "it was yours, legally. Your grandfather didn't sell it back to the state in the 80s like the county claimed. He put it in a trust. For you. Holt knew that. He buried the original trust documents. He used the complex chain of title to confuse the court. He didn't just frame you. He stole your inheritance." Eli froze. The blood drained from his face. He stared out at the river. The water was calm now, muddy but calm. "My grandfather's land," Eli whispered. "He left it to me." "Yes," Maggie said. Eli sat down heavily on a wooden crate. He buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He wasn't crying from joy. He was crying from the sheer, crushing weight of the violation. "They took everything," Eli choked out. "They took my name. They put me in a cage. And they made me believe I was crazy. They made me believe I was nothing." Maggie slid off the railing. She knelt in the dirt right in front of him. She pulled his hands away from his face. "Look at me," Maggie demanded gently. Eli looked at her. His eyes were red and raw. "Listen to my words, Eli McRae," Maggie said, enunciating every syllable. "They stole your property. They stole your time. But they never touched your dignity. Do you hear me? Human dignity is an inviolable birthright. No corrupt judge, no greedy politician, and no prison cell can ever strip it away from you." Eli took a shaky breath. "The system failed you," Maggie continued, her voice unwavering. "It was weaponized against you. But your worth as a human being has always been intact. It was shining bright the morning you rode into that flood to save my children. You are an honorable man, and tonight the whole world knows it." Eli stared at her. The truth of her words settled into his bones. The heavy coat of shame he had worn for 5 years finally dropped away. The screen door squeaked open. Tommy walked out onto the porch. He was wearing a pair of old denim jeans and boots that were a little too big for him. He walked straight up to Eli. Tommy looked up. His face was serious. "Mr. Eli," Tommy said. His voice was clear, no stutter, no hesitation. "I want to learn to ride Dusk. I want you to teach me." It was a full, complete sentence, a demand made out of absolute trust. Eli looked at the little boy. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. It reached all the way to his eyes. "Saturday morning," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "If the ground is dry, we saddle him up." Tommy nodded once. A business deal concluded. He turned and walked back inside. The porch was quiet again. The crickets started to sing in the high grass. Eli stood up. He reached down and offered Maggie his hand. She took it. He pulled her up. He didn't let go of her hand. "You saved my life, Maggie," Eli said quietly. "You saved mine first," she replied. They stood close in the fading light. There was no desperate rush, no frantic grabbing. This wasn't trauma bonding. This was a choice. Two adults, battered by the world, choosing to step into the light together. Eli reached up and gently cupped her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone. Maggie leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes. When he kissed her, it was soft. It was steady. It tasted like coffee and rain and absolute freedom. It was the kiss of an equal, a promise made without a single word. 6 months later. Spring came to West Texas like a deep breath. The muddy, scarred earth along the Pecos River erupted in color. Blue bonnets and Indian paintbrushes blanketed the hills in vivid purple and bright red. The world had righted itself. Raymond Holt was sitting in a federal holding cell in Austin, awaiting trial for wire fraud, land theft, and corruption. The judge who helped him was disbarred. Eli's name was cleared, completely. It wasn't just a pardon, it was an exoneration. The state returned his grandfather's land. He was a free man with a clean record and a deed in his pocket. But he didn't build a new house on his grandfather's land. He stayed at the cabin. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was warm and golden. The cabin had been repaired. Fresh paint, new floorboards, a sturdy new roof. On the front porch, a small crowd was gathered. There was no church aisle, no organ music, just the sound of the river and the wind in the mesquite trees. Maggie stood on the porch. She wore a simple white cotton dress. Her hair was pulled back. She held a bouquet of wildflowers Lily had picked that morning. She looked beautiful. She looked at peace. Eli stood facing her. He wore a clean white shirt, a dark vest, and a new Stetson. He held her hands. The local county judge, a new one, a fair one, stood between them with a worn Bible open in his hands. Rosa was standing to the side. She wore her mother Clara's favorite dress, altered to fit her. She was smiling. Lily was sitting on the porch railing, swinging her legs. Tommy stood right next to Eli, wearing a miniature Stetson and looking incredibly proud. A few yards away, tied to the hitching post, Dusk stood quietly, a silent witness. "Before we do the rings," the judge said kindly, "I believe you wrote your own vows." Eli nodded. He looked at Maggie. His dark eyes were clear. "Maggie," Eli said, his voice steady and rhythmic, "I have spent a lot of my life locked away, in a cell and inside my own head. I thought I had to be alone. But you taught me differently. I promise to always honor your independence. I promise to never make you feel small. I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that true love is about freedom, never restraint. I choose you today, not because I need saving, but because my life is only complete when you are in it." Maggie smiled. Her eyes were bright with tears. "Eli," she said softly, but her voice carried to everyone on the porch. "I locked my heart away because I was terrified of losing anyone else. I thought survival meant building a wall. But you and these children taught me the absolute truth. The greatest right a human being has is the right to love. And the greatest courage is allowing yourself to be loved in return. I choose you, Eli, as my partner, as my equal, always. The judge smiled. Does anyone here have any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage? It was a standard procedural question. Nobody ever answered it. But Tommy raised his hand. The judge blinked. Eli and Maggie turned to look at him. Tommy took off his small hat. He looked at Eli. He was dead serious. I don't object, Tommy said clearly. I just want to know, does this mean Mr. Eli is my dad now? The silence lasted for one heartbeat. Then Rosa laughed. A loud, joyful, unburdened laugh. Lily clapped her hands. Eli let go of Maggie's hands. He knelt down on the wooden porch right in front of Tommy. If you want me to be, Tommy, Eli said, his voice thick. It would be the greatest honor of my life to be your dad. Tommy nodded once. Doet kwat. Okay, let's do it. Epilogue. 2 years later, late summer. Maggie stood on the porch of the cabin. It was 5:30 in the morning. She held a mug of coffee. But this time the coffee was hot. The sky in the east was turning a brilliant, soft pink. It was the most beautiful sky she had ever seen. Inside the house, Rosa was sitting at the kitchen table. She was 13 now. She was writing in her journal. The Spanish flowed easily from her pen. To my Mama Clara in heaven, I want you to know we are okay. More than okay. Thank you for letting Mama Maggie and Dad Eli find us. Today, I am writing about what family means. Dad Eli says family isn't just about sharing blood. Family is about the people who respect your basic rights. The people who respect your right to live, your right to make mistakes, and your right to be loved every single day. I know you would like him. Outside, the screen door banged open. Tommy ran out, his boots thumping on the wood. He was 9 years old, tall for his age. He ran straight for the corral they had built near the barn. Eli was already out there. He had Dusk saddled. He lifted Tommy up, setting the boy firmly in the leather saddle. Lily ran out after them, carrying a carrot for the horse. Wait for me. Maggie leaned against the porch railing. She took a sip of her coffee. She watched her husband guide the horse around the corral. She watched her son laugh. She watched her youngest daughter feed the massive black animal. She listened to her oldest daughter humming in the kitchen. There was no crisis to manage, no fear of tomorrow, no battle to fight. Eli looked over the wooden fence. He caught Maggie's eye. He tipped his hat back just a little and gave her a slow, easy smile. Maggie smiled back. She took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. She was a combat nurse, a widow, a mother, a wife. But mostly she was free, and right here, on the banks of the Pecos River, she was finally home.
As this story comes to a close, it reminds us that true courage is not about reputation, but about the choices we make when everything is on the line. This channel brings you stories of Western cowboys, love in the wildlands, the sacred bond of motherhood, and the quiet compassion between human souls, told with heart and truth. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Never judge a person by what the world says about them. Judge them by what they do when it matters most. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that stay with you long after they end. As the waters recede and the dust of that storm settles back into the Texas earth, what remains is not just a story of survival, but a story of truth. Because out there, on the edge of the Pecos River, something far greater than a flood was tested. It wasn't just a house that stood or fell. It was trust. It was dignity. It was the quiet, stubborn belief that every human life holds equal worth, no matter what the world has said about them. Maggie stood at the crossroads of fear and faith, and she chose to see beyond judgment. And in doing so, she didn't just save 3 children. She helped restore a man's name, his purpose, and his place in the world. Eli McRae, a man buried under years of silence and shame, proved that character is not written by rumors or verdicts, but by the choices a person makes when no one is watching, when the river is rising and turning back is no longer an option. This story reminds us that real strength is not loud. It doesn't come from power or control. It comes from compassion, from standing your ground when the world tells you to step aside, and from having the courage to trust when it would be easier to walk away. It teaches us that family is not something we are simply born into. It is something we build, piece by piece, through loyalty, sacrifice, and love. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that dignity is not something that can be given or taken by others. It lives inside each of us, unbreakable, waiting for the moment we choose to stand up and claim it. In a world that often rushes to judge, this story asks us to pause, to look deeper, and to remember that behind every scar, every silence, and every hardened face, there is a story we may never fully understand. And sometimes, the very people we are taught to fear are the ones who carry the greatest capacity for kindness. So if there is one thing to carry with you after this story ends, let it be this. Choose empathy over judgment, courage over fear, and truth over silence, because those choices don't just change stories, they change lives. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.